Yes. So now it's time to build the dashboard. But to do that, we have to have data to actually make the dashboard work. And right now we only have three different collections. We have the account collection, the session, and the user. They're all related to authentication, and we didn't really have to make them ourselves. Now we have to create our own collections and structure how the data will look like. If you can see, actually make the dashboard work. And right now we only have three different collections. We have the account collection, the session, and the user. They're all related to authentication, and we didn't really have to make them ourselves. Now we have to create our own collections and structure how the data will look like. If you can see, each collection has obviously documents inside of it. At least in the user, there's only one of them, and it has very specific fields like ID, name, email, and so on. We want to do the same thing, but define the fields for the other collections we want to create. Now, to create a collection in MongoDB, we're going to open up our tab over here, and in the lib folder, I want to create a new folder called models. This is going to be where we defined all three of them are going to interact together. The first one is going to be the board. So we're going to create a board.ts. I'm actually going to make it lowercase, board.ts, and here we're going to define how a board looks like. Now, to define the schema for this collection, we have to import Mongoose from Mongoose and also import a couple types, more specifically the schema type and the document type. Then we want to create an interface. I'm going to export an interface called iBoard. I for interface and board because this is the interface for the board. And because we're creating an interface that is part of a schema for a collection, this interface is going to extend document, which is the type that this interface is going to represent. So I'm going to say iBoard extends document. Then we define the fields that we want to include on this document, and the document will include all of the other extra fields like ID and so on. Now, what fields do we want on a board? Well, a board will have a name. Like a name for a board is the job board. It's also going to have a user ID, which is just the ID of the user who created the board. Then it's going to have columns. Now, the columns, there are going to be actually of a very special type, because if you think about it, a column is going to be another collection that we're going to have in our project. So for now, we're just going to make it be the following type: mongoose.types, we wrote that wrong, .types, .object ID array. Now, what does this mean? It means that on the columns that we have here, it's actually going to be a list of IDs of another collection that we have. Now, we haven't made the collection yet, so it's going to be kind of hard for us to understand, but we can continue moving forward and then we'll get back. The next two fields are the created at, which has a type of date, and the updated at. I always like to make those two fields just because they are good to know and have when you are creating or keeping track of data in your collection. Then we want to create the actual collection. And to do that, we want to define a MongoDB schema. I'm going to call this the board schema and set this equal to new schema of type iBoard. Now, inside of here, I'll create an object, and in this object, we're going to define again all of the types we have here, but we're going to add additional types and the configurations that are specific for MongoDB. For example, the name field, we want to give a type to it. And here we put MongoDB types. Now, what is a MongoDB type? For example, a string is a type that we can put here. Also, we can put other configurations, like if whether or not we want this item to be required in order to create a new board. And for the name, we do want to make it required because you don't want to create a board without a name. Same thing with user ID. User ID should have a type of string and it should be required. Now, we'll also create an index on user ID. Indexes are specialized data structures that allow the database to find matching documents efficiently. We'll query boards by user ID, so we'll have to create an index on this field. It is highly recommended that your queries are always covered by an index to improve efficiency. We want to set index equal to true. Then we're going to come here and we're going to set the type for columns. Now that's a bit hard. Why? Because again, remember, columns is going to be actually a list of IDs of another collection, a collection we haven't even made yet. However, we can already start defining what that looks like. To define that it's a list, we put the list, the open and close the square brackets, and then we put an object in here. And then we define what goes inside of each item in that list. So what goes inside is the type is going to be of schema.types.object ID, which just represents an ID of an entry on this collection. Then we need to put a ref, and a ref is going to be a reference to which other collection is this object ID from. I know this is a bit confusing, but don't worry, it's all going to make sense. Now, the reference here is going to be column, because we're going to create another model for the column collection. For now, we can just leave it like that. And finally, I want to add one more thing. We want to come down here and add another object, which will allow us to give some more configurations. And we're going to set timestamp to true. Now, what does timestamps equal to true do here? Well, if you notice, when we defined our board schema, we didn't include the created at and updated at. That's because if we set timestamps to true, it's going to automatically add the created at and updated at field to every single document that is added on this without the need of doing anything else. So we perfectly created our schema. We set up each field with a type and required. We set up an index on the user ID field so that it is going to index that field and make queries for it be faster when searching, so that we don't have to always be ID field, so that it is going to index that field and make queries for it to be faster when searching, so that we don't have to always be because this is a pretty useful thing to do if we're always going to be querying for a user ID. And in the end, we have created the schema that we can now generate a collection for. Now, we have created the schema, but we actually didn't create the actual collection. If I refresh here, you see nothing appears over here. That for the actual collection. If I refresh here, you see nothing appears over here. For that to happen, we have to register our collection. So I'm going to come down below here and I am going to export default and I want to export the mongoose.models, and then I'm going to say dot board, or I'm going to export the mongoose.model, and I'm going to create it. If this one doesn't exist, I'm going to create the board by utilizing the model function, passing the iBoard as the type, and then I give a name to this collection. It's going to be board, and I have to pass a schema. So what this is going to do is whenever I use it, it's going to create this collection called board, and it's going to have this schema. Okay, so now what do we do? Does it automatically generate it over here? Well, sure. However, I want to create the other schema. It's going to be board, and I have to pass a schema. So what this is going to do is whenever I use it, it's going to create this collection called board, and it's going to have this schema. Okay. So now what do we do? Does it automatically generate it over here? Well, sure. However, I want to create the other schema. It's going to be board, and I have to pass a schema. So what this is going to do is whenever I use it, it's going to create this collection called board, and it's going to have this schema. Okay, so now what do we do? Does it automatically generate it over here? Well, sure. However, I want to create the other schemas as well before we can check all of that. And one thing I want to point out is if you go here to the landing page, remember this is how we are going to have the dashboard page, right? It's going to be board, and I have to pass a schema. So what this is going to do is whenever I use it, it's going to create this collection called board, and it's going to have this schema. Okay, so now what do we do? Does it automatically generate it over here? Well, sure. However, I want to create the other schemas as well before we can check all of that. And one thing I want to point out is if you go here to the landing page, remember this is how we are going to have the dashboard page, right? There's going to be a board, and a board represents this entire set over here. Then inside of a board, there's going to be columns, right? There's going to be the wish list column, the applied column, the interviewing column, the offer column. Different columns represent different stages in the application process. And inside of each column, there's going to be actual job applications. So a user can create different job applications, put it in their desired column, and then maybe even move it around. You can create different job applications, put it in their desired column, and then maybe even move it around to a different column. So remember, there's 3 different collections. So how do we create those collections? I'm going to copy this board.ts. I'm going to create a copy of it, and I'm going to create the next collection, which is going to be the column collection. Now the column collection is going to be very similar. I'm going to copy and paste here how it's going to look like, and it's going to be almost exactly the same, and I'll go over what each of the fields mean. So collection, which is going to be the column collection. Now the column collection is going to be very similar. I'm going to copy and paste here how it's going to look like, and it's going to be almost exactly the same, and I'll go over what each of the fields mean. So of course we're going to create now an image depending on interface called iColumn instead of iBoard. And then inside of the iColumn, there's going to be the following fields. It's going to have a name because a column has a name, as you can see, wish list, applied, interviewing, whatever we choose. It's going to have a board ID so that we know which board this column is part of. So not all job applications are going to have, or not all dashboards are going to have the same columns. You can create your own column, you can delete your own column, but they're going to have obviously the default ones by start. Then there's going to be the order. Why is the order important? Well, because the order represents the order of the column in reference to the beginning. So the wish list is order 0, meaning it's the first column in this board. Then applied would be order 1, interviewing 2, and so on. And then job applications. This is going to be a list of object IDs similar to what we had here for the columns. So the structure is pretty interesting. A board will have columns which will have job applications, right? So in the board, a board contains the list of columns, and a column contains the list of job applications, so that we know where these job applications exist in and where the columns exist, like which board the column exists in. So we're going to have the same kind of structure. We're also going to have the created at and updated at, and we're going to define the schema. The schema for column is also very similar. The same thing for name, same thing for board ID as we had over here. Now the only difference is that we set here in the board ID a reference. Now we kind of did this over here as well, but we did it for the columns and not for the actual board as well. But we did it for the column. Only the schema for column is also very similar. The same thing for name, same thing for board ID as we had over here. Now the only difference is that we set here in the board ID a reference. Now we kind of did this over here as well. but we did it for the columns and not for the actual um, board ID. If you look at the reference we had on the board, it was for the user ID, and we made it be an index, which is what we're also doing over here. But the user ID is of type string instead of being of a type object ID, which is what we're also actual board ID. If you look at the reference we had on the board, it was for the user ID, and we made it be an index, which is what we're also doing over here. But the user ID is of type string instead of being of a type object ID like we have over here. Now, when you see schema.types.objectID here, that's just the type MongoDB uses for the default ID field. Every document in MongoDB gets an ID field, and by default, it is an object ID. Also, you don't have to use object ID fields to relate data. You can join or look up any field that shares the same value, even string ID. Also, you don't have to use object ID fields to relate data. You can join or look up any field that shares the same value, even strings. In our case, with user ID, it's just a string that comes from better auth. But for board ID, we did create the board schema. And what this basically says is, first of all, it's going to store the ID of the board. It'll create a relationship between the column schema and the board schema. And by indexing, it's going to make queries faster. Quick note on this data model. Our board has an array of columns. Each column stores a board ID, and columns also keep an array of job applications, while each job application stores a column ID and a board ID. This is called bidirectional references because the relationship is stored in both directions. It makes some queries and the drag and drop UI that we're going to be making later easier, but it duplicates the same relationship in multiple places. In real life, high traffic production system, that can actually make writes more complex, increase the risk of getting data out of sync if one update actually fails, and slow things down when these arrays get very large. For bigger apps, you would actually pick a single direction for each relationship, typically just storing, for example, a column ID and querying by that index, or making sure that you use transactions so moves and reorders happen automatically. However, for the purpose of this beginner video, we're going to do it this way. Now, the next one is going to be order. It's of type number and it's required. And also you can pass a default value, as you can see over here, which means that if we for some reason don't pass anything when trying to add a new column, it's going to default the order to 0, which makes sense, right? The first column we add is going to be 0, and the second one is going to be 1, and so on. And then finally, for job applications, it's the same reference we did here for columns. We're basically creating a reference to the next model that we're going to create, which is going to be the job applications. And then we also enable timestamps, so it auto-populates the created at and updated at. And then in the end, we export the model. Now, to finalize this, we're going to make the last one. It's going to be the job applications. Now, this one, it's going to be a bit bigger. And I added a couple other things we're going to keep track of from a job application that we might not even use. However, I added so that you could add a functionality for it if you want to as an extra feature to this project. So here is what this code is going to look like. And I know it's a lot, but I'll go over each and every single field. So a job application has a lot to it. If you go here on the manage boards, you'll see that when we try to, it's kind of hard to see, but when we try to add a job application, there's a lot of different parts of what represents a job application. There's obviously the company, so the name of the company, the position in which you're applying, the location, the salary, the job URL, which is a link to the company job site, and then any tags you want to add. Finally, a description, notes. And there's more to it because remember, we also have to keep track of who is applying for this job. So the user ID, we have to keep track of where this job application is in, so which column is in. So in this case, it's going to be the wish list, or in this one is going to be the applied. And then we also have to keep track of the board in which is the name of the is the item. The here we find some of them that are rules that require we make the type be an object ID. As you can see here is the tags, because tags is a list of different tag brackets and all of our things. Finally, we again export the model. So we have successfully created the model for all of our collections. What do we do now? Well, for convenience, I'm going to create an index.ts file over here that is going to export all of the different models that we created. And I just have to import from this index.ts instead of from each individual file. So in here, I am going to import the import from the index instead of from the individual file. So here I can say column, and here I can say a job application, and then here I'll change this to say column, and I'll change this to say job application. Perfect. Now this seems to be working and we can continue moving forward. Now, when a user creates an account, I want it to actually automatically add a default board with a default set of columns in the user's account. What do I mean? So when the user creates their account and they go to the dashboard, I want them to see this right here, a board already made for them that has the default options that we define. So it's going to have a wish list, an applied, an interviewing, an offer, a rejected fields, popular already create that our table. So what I like to do here is I would like to create a function that when ran, it is going to initialize the default board for all users. Now, this kind of functionality is a helper function, right? It's a helper function that we want to run in the server. So it's going to be a server function that we can run at the state in which the user is creating their account. So to do that, we want to come into our lib folder over here, and I'm going to create a file here called init user board.ts. This means that when the user creates their account, I'm going to create a file here called init user board.ts. This means I'm going to create a file here called init connect to our initial boards from the user. How do we get that? Well, when we call this function, we're going to pass that information here, handle the error here. So I'm going to go deep. Started, what is get the and so I'll know this as create that column because to create the columns. So create default column multiple times already of what rejected and so on. Now you can change the names if you want to, change the orders as well, make less of them, make more, I don't know, whatever you prefer. But for now, we're gonna just keep the one that I had, column off. Now what do we want to await? We want to run the promise.all. And if you're not familiar with promise.all, it basically lets the multiple item on the board. So that we can now for the gonna pass, you see that every did use state when board more now we got it after the user it's so we shouldn't the actions I mean the three that we just created they aren't here, but then let's create a user. So now let's check here. If user ID is not null, then I want to call that. Perfect. So now let's check this. For refresh here, you see that we don't have anything. So if I refresh here, no collections. I mean, the three that we just created, they aren't here. But then let's create a user. I'm going to call this user. Then I'll put then I'll put a password. I'll click sign up, and visually we shouldn't see anything happening. But if I refresh this, what we should see is that now all of the new columns or collections that we created, the job applications, columns, and boards should have been created. because so argument it so now let's actions so now let's then our collections that we create and the board, and when we call this initialize user board. But not only that, if you look here for the user floor, and that introduces us to a very important